The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I had just left the country of white lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a community town, it sounded like a great idea. We found a house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow, 80 a month. But at the last minute, a firm ordered into Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog. At least I had him for a few days until he ran away. And an old Dutch and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man who recently arrived and I stopped me on the road. How do you get to the West Lake Village? He asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked down I was slowly no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so with the sunshine and the great bars of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had a familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read for one thing, and so much fine had to be pulled down out of the young breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and new like gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Mercedes knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year, I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things, and I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window. After all, it was a matter of chance that I should rent a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on the slender Riders Island, which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of nervous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a coarse bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the Great Wet Barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect doubles, like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed back at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the windlass, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. I leave the West Egg, the well, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tech to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. To the My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some hotel de ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, expecting new under a thin beard of ivy, and a marble swimming pool and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion, or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consul in proximity, a millionaire's, all for $80 a month. Across the Cars Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water. And the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with Tom Buchanan's. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I known Tom in college. And just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ants that ever played football in New Haven. One of those, a national figure in a way. One of those men who reached such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterward savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, it brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone. But I didn't believe it. I had no sign to Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, sticking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened that on a warm windy evening, I drove over there to have I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends Vasquez knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when you reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vibes as from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold, and wide open to the warm in the afternoon, and Tom Buchanan, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. Two shiny, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to feel his glistening boots until strained to top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff husky tenor, added to the impression of freshness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked. And there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. Now, don't think my opinion on this matter is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flash, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad flat hand, including in its sleeve a sunken Italian, including in its sleeve a sunken Italian garden, a half acre of deep pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to the main yawing man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. We go inside. We walked through a high hallway into a bright, rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh gray south side that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blue curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and rippled and then rippled over the wine called the rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea.